Hi, welcome to this session by RouteFabric.com. In today's session, we're going to talk about data types and the numeric data types in Python. So a data type in Python is just a classification of a variable that describes the type of the value. So for example, if I had x equals 200, do lowercase. I created a variable x and I assigned it the value 200, but in Python, when you assign a value to a variable, it's automatically given a type. So in this case, 200 is a whole number, so it'd be given the type integer. Python, unlike in some other languages like C++, you can't explicitly give a variable a type without giving it a value. In Python, the way it works is you give a variable a value and then it's given a default type. So again, this tutorial will be about the numeric data types. So there's two more of those. There's said y equals 250.57. The type of this would be float. And then if I had z equals 3 plus 5j, this would be complex. So an integer is any whole number, positive or negative, including 0. But yeah, it's just a whole number. Y is any positive or negative number that has a decimal part or a decimal portion. And the complex is any number that has an imaginary portion. So I don't know if you remember math, but imaginary numbers are when you have square root of a negative number. So if you have square root of -1 or square root of -5, that would be an imaginary number. You can't actually evaluate the number, but it still has a value in math, so we give it kind of like a placeholder. And then that's part of the imaginary number. So the first part would be called the real part. So again, 3 is a real number. It's like a normal number. And then 5j, this would be like an imaginary part. So it'd be like imaginary 5 square root of -1. But this is just a basic introduction, so I'm not going to get into too much of what that means. But imaginary numbers have a basic form. A plus bi. So this is probably, if you remember like high school math, this is probably what you would have seen. And A is just the real number, and then BI would be the imaginary part, and it would have a coefficient. Also, if when it comes to graphing in math, a basic graph that has 2 dimensions, like the x and y axes, the name for that is the Cartesian coordinate plane. That's the most basic graph that you learn in high school. But if you deal with imaginary numbers, it uses the imaginary plane. And then the first part is the real number, and then the second part is the imaginary number again. So just something to keep in mind, that imaginary numbers, they're very important in like more advanced math, but they use a different graphing coordinate system. So if you wanted to print the type of these variables, you could use the print function, I mean not the print function, the type function. So to print the type of x, y, and z if you run. So again, x is an integer, y is a float, and z is a complex. In Python, you can also change the type of a variable without changing the value. So if you added 0.000 to 200, the type would change to a float, because Python sees a decimal portion, so it automatically types this variable as a float. But if you remove that and you still only had the 200, and it's an integer, but later in your program you wanted to change this to a float, so you could work with other floats or something like that, You could retype x into a float using the constructor function of the float class. So you could do x equals float x. And again, if this is one of your first times coding, this may seem a little bit confusing, but don't think of the don't think of the equals as an actual equals, think of it as assignment. So you already have x is 200, and then on this line, you're assigning x a new type. You're assigning it the float type. So if you run, I gotta print it again. You run, it'll take a few seconds. Okay, run again, and then again the type has been changed from an integer to a float. So you printed the type again, you got a float. So it's the same exact value, but you change the type. When you try to change the type of a variable, a type is like the variable is an instance of an object, and then that instance is given a type. The type is the class of the object. So that's why it says class. I'm not going to get into classes in this tutorial, but just think of it as every object has to have a type, and then if you want to change the type of an object, or you want to know what the type of an object is, that's instantiated, or it's given that type using the constructor of the class. So when we said x equals float x, float is kind of a class. It's a class that's a data type. So you took the old x, which was an integer, and then you use the constructor of the float class and changed it into a float, and then you set that new value to 100, but considered a float, and then you put it back in x. So this changes it into a float, and then you after you change it into a float, you have to put it back into the variable. It's a little bit confusing if you haven't done a lot of coding before, but that's basically what's happening. So you can do this with other constructors. So if you said x equals, actually I'll make this a little bit more clear. So if you had, just say d equals float x, and then you printed d, you would still see float. So d has the type float, but it's if you printed d, you get 200.0, and again that 0.0 is given because it's a float instead of just the regular integer 200. And then you could also do it with you could also change x into a complex type. So if you had e equals complex x, and then you printed x, or printed e. And you run again. So you see now we changed x into a complex number, and then we printed, we put it in e, and then we printed the type, and we printed the value. So you see it's a complex number now, and then it has the value 200 plus 0j. So this is, just think of this as the imaginary portion of the number, and then think of the 200 as the actual, like the real number part of the imaginary part of the. In a complex number, there's the real and the imaginary part. The 200 is the real part, and then the 0j is the imaginary part. And if you remember, anything times 0 is 0, so it's almost like in the value of this whole number, the 200 is the only actual number. And again, it has this form a plus bi. In Python, the default letter is J for the imaginary part, which you could see in math sometimes too. But I'm assuming the default letter is J because I is used in things like loops and that, but I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. One other thing with floats is just like if you ever used a scientific calculator recently, you can indicate powers of 10 with the letter E. So if you ever seen on a scientific calculator like there's an E button on most scientific calculators or graphing calculators, and it would look like this when you put it into the calculator, 8.55 E7, and this stands for 8.55 times 10 to the 7th power. So this would be the same as these are the two. These two are the same thing. You could use lowercase too if you want, but if you printed this, you see it's about, I think it's 85 million. Yeah, that's 85,500,000. And you can also, it could be lowercase e too. The same. You run again and you still get the same. So yeah, you can use powers of 10 using the letter E if you put it in part of a number. And just one other thing about the numeric data types is there is no basic random number generator function in Python. So what you have to do is you have to import the random module, and then you have to use the rand range function. So if you have if you import random, and then down here, let's say you wanted a number between 1 and 1,000, you do print rand random.rand range, and you do 1 to 1,000. Then if you run, you get 438. You run it again, you get 151. I'm assuming it creates the random number based on the time. That's called the seed. C++, you have to seed a random number generator, and usually it's the time. So it'll do a bunch of calculations, and then based on whatever the time is, it'll pick a random number between 1 and 1,000. I don't know exactly how it works, but usually it's based on the time. So yeah, that's a basic introduction to data types and the numeric data types. I hope you found this informative. And if you want to check out anything else with Python or data types, be sure to check out our courses at RouteFabric.com. So thank you. Bye.